everybody, and a very warm welcome along to Real Israel. This is Paul Alster. I'm delighted to say that I'm here with the second in a series of special interviews. And my guest this afternoon is none other than Ambassador Danny Danon, the former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. He's also head of World Likud and is a former Minister of Science, Technology and Space, as well as being the Deputy Defense Minister in the past in the Israeli government. Now, he's also tipped by some as a future leader of the Likud party, and who knows, possibly a future Prime Minister. It depends which way the cookie crumbles. Ambassador Danon, thank you very much for joining me. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion today.
I'm looking forward to it. And of course, today it's Holocaust Memorial Day. Of course, the day that we're recording this particular interview, a very significant day here in Israel and for Jews around the world. And I know that your life, even from a very young man, you've been involved in Jewish causes. So what does it mean to you in particular today, this particular memorial that we have every year on the 27th of January?
Indeed, Paul, today is a very important day for us. In Israel, we commemorate the Holocaust Remembrance Day in May, but this is the International Remembrance Day. And I think we have to remind the nations of the world what happened during the Holocaust, not only in Europe, but what happened in all capitals of the world. We have to remind them the silence of their leaders during the Holocaust. And today we know that all of them knew about the atrocities of the Holocaust, and at the same time they kept quiet. And I think the lesson of today should be we should never be quiet again.
Well, absolutely. It's a memorial that rings true for Jewish people around the world, and also it strikes a note as well for people around the world that have been suffering and singled out for no good reason. I want to just ask you, we've had so many things going on, of course, in the news of late, before we come on to discuss your role at the United Nations, which was so significant. But obviously, coronavirus is the big issue in the world at the moment, and Israel is getting a very good press around the world because of its vaccination program. How would you characterize what's happened, and how much credit would you give to the Prime Minister in these circumstances?
So first of all, I don't think it's still time for celebrations or victories. We are still in the middle of a crisis, a health crisis, economical crisis. So yes, we are proud of the effort of Prime Minister Netanyahu to bring vaccines to Israel. But at the same time, when we look at the numbers in Israel today, and as we speak, we are in the middle of a third lockdown. I hope it will be the last one, but it's not over. So I don't think we should be celebrating. I think we should be very responsible, very serious about this issue. And at the same time, we should be grateful for the leadership that provided the vaccines to whoever wants to get vaccinated here in Israel.
Well, certainly around the world, a lot of countries are very envious of the vaccination program that we've undergone so far, and it certainly has moved ahead very quickly. I had my second vaccination just a couple of days ago, so it is remarkable, really, when you compare the situations to other countries. But of course, as you pointed out, there have been issues with difficulties in suppressing the number of infections, and there have been demonstrations as well here in Israel by a number of groups, but in particular by the Ultraorthodox. How concerned are you by their behavior at this point, and are you concerned that their leadership is not sticking closely enough to the guidance offered by the government?
So I think first we should not generalize. I think the majority of the Ultra-Orthodox do follow the guidelines, do understand the importance of the guidelines. But yes, there are a few who choose to make an issue of the corona. They choose to get into a fight with the policemen, and we should not tolerate it. We should demand that everybody will follow the guidelines, but I wouldn't label it as the ultra-Orthodox. You have in Israel more than 1.5 million Jews. You can define them as religious. So I think, I don't know the exact number, but I would assume that more than 90% actually follow all the guidelines.
I'd assume that you're right, but of course, if it is 10% that aren't, we're talking a significant number of people, and it is a concern, and proportionately the numbers of infections amongst the ultra-Orthodox and Haredi community are very high. So we hope for everybody's sake, including, of course, all the Haredim, that they do take very, very seriously what's happening. I noticed, though, that when the Prime Minister speaks about the instructions and the guidance, he very clearly states that this must be done. But according to some media reports, he's been requesting the Rabbanim, the rabbis who lead the ultra-Orthodox, to make these changes rather than demanding. If you were in charge, would you be demanding that they follow exactly the same rules as everybody else, and that there isn't a second port of call for getting a decision on whether they should or shouldn't follow the guidelines?
I think we should do both. First, we should ask. From my experience with the Orthodox community, if you speak with the rabbis, with the rabbanim, they listen to you. They are smart people. They care about the health of their population. So I think first we should have a dialogue. But if it doesn't work, and if you see mass gathering, you should apply the law, and you should not allow it to happen. And it doesn't matter who is doing what. You know, it's national health, national security, and we should not break the rules, and we should not allow anyone to do that.
Well, we do hope that, of course, everybody follows the rules, and the sooner they do, the quicker we'll all be moving out of this terrible situation we find ourselves in. But I want to discuss a number of things with you, because you've spent 4 years at the United Nations as Israel's ambassador.
Actually, it was 5.
Or was it okay? Or was it 4 that just felt like 5?
And we have a joke in the UN that for the Israeli ambassador every year it's like 7 years. So
I was going to say,
a long period of time.
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate enough to interview your predecessor, Ron Prosor, after his time at the United Nations, and he made the point about the challenges that you've hinted at there, and how difficult it can be. But he felt that it was absolutely necessary for Israel to be represented well in the United Nations, despite the fact that the cards are very much stacked against us. How did you feel when you first were appointed to the job? Was it a mixture of feelings?
So I was very proud, to receive the nomination from the government, from the Prime Minister. For years, I was active in, we call it Hasbara, in promoting Israel worldwide. And I felt that it was the right decision, even though I have to tell you, some of my colleagues in the government told me I should not leave the government. But I felt it was the right thing, and I think it was the right decision. In Israel, the media is very vicious, so many were very skeptical about what will happen at the UN. And I am proud that I proved them wrong, with hard work, building a network of connections, and bringing my values into the whole of the UN. I was able to prove that we can even win in a hostile place like the UN, and we can accomplish a lot in the UN. So I am very proud of what I did during those 5 years. And I think today we can continue and do more in the international arena.
And when you look back at those 5 years, what would you say was your biggest achievement? And what would you say was your biggest frustration in the job that you had to do there?
So I will start with the frustration, because it's exactly nowadays, 4 years ago, during the transition period, before President Obama left office, he decided to push a resolution to the Security Council, Resolution 2334. It was a nasty resolution condemning Israel, calling our presence in the old city of Jerusalem a flagrant violation of international law. And I had to fight by myself. Usually it's Israel and the US against everybody else. But during that period, I was by myself fighting against the US and against the entire UN. And unfortunately, the resolution passed in the Security Council. But I was very strong in my speech, and I told them that things will change. And little did I know that a year later, I will be in the same room when the embassy of the US actually moved to Jerusalem. And then I was instrumental in bringing the embassy of Guatemala from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So I'm optimistic by nature. The highlight, I think, for me was when I was elected to become the first Israeli ever to chair the legal committee, the sixth committee. I remember my colleagues were very skeptical again about the chances of getting elected, because we know you have a strong majority against Israel in the General Assembly. And I worked quietly. I met most of the ambassadors, and I knew I had the votes. But when they counted the votes, it was secret ballots. Everybody showed up, and when they counted the votes and announced that I received the support of 109 ambassadors, and only 44 voted against me, I was very proud for myself, for my family, and most importantly, for my country.
And indeed, it was a very big achievement, and it was a big step forward for Israel at the UN. I just wondered, obviously, you'd spent your life prior to going out to New York to represent Israel at the United Nations as a politician, and then you move across to the UN where you're working essentially as a diplomat. And I'm interested to know, what's the difference really between a politician and a diplomat? What were the differences you found, and how did you approach the job differently to what you would in the Knesset, for example?
Well, I can tell you it's much harder to be a diplomat, because you have to think very carefully about every step. You have to think very carefully about every word, about every line you write. And I was used to come to the podium in the Knesset and to speak freely about my values, my ideas, my intentions. And you cannot do it at the UN. When you speak, in front of the world, you have to write your speech, you have to read your speech. Sometimes, I had the freedom of elaborating, but I was very careful about that. And I can tell you that I think bringing a experience from politics into diplomacy, I think it's a positive thing. Also, my dear colleague, Ambassador Nikki Haley, came from a political position of a governor. And when you have the support and the strength to take decisions by yourself, it shows. So, among the ambassadors, most of them will have to call their capitals in order to get instructions. But when you have the support of the government, when you were a minister in the government, you have the strength and the stamina to take decisions by yourself. And that's very important, because it shows, and people appreciate you when they know that you actually get to decide by yourself.
And of course, you hinted at one of the big issues that changed the ballpark, so to speak, was the change in administration in the United States. When you first arrived, it was still the Obama years, and then President Trump got elected, and he was very supportive of Israel on just about every issue, and you made the issue. Did you ever get to meet President Trump during your time there?
Absolutely. I met President Trump before he was even a candidate, and I met him when he was a president. And we worked very closely with Ambassador Nikki Haley and Ambassador Kraft. And overall, we achieved a lot during those 5 years. And I will tell you something that you will be surprised. We also achieved a lot during the years of President Obama at the UN. Beside the event I specified before he left, we did a lot of things together, and we achieved a lot of things together. So overall, Israel and the US work very closely in the UN arena, regardless of who is sitting in the White House.
And just talking about sitting in the White House, because of course the seat has changed again, but just your thoughts. Obviously, you appear to have had a good relationship with the Trump administration. It was an administration that wasn't popular in many countries around the world, but certainly had a very good sort of symbiotic relationship with Israel. But in the closing days of that, how did you feel when you saw what happened on the Capitol? Did that in any way give you very mixed feelings about what Trump had done and what the legacy would be?
No, I think first we should be grateful for President Trump and the administration for what they did. We cannot ignore it. The recognition of Jerusalem as our capital, the recognition of the Golan Heights, pulling out from the Iran deal, that's the most important decision, I think, of the administration. The Abraham Accords, today I speak with many colleagues in the Gulf, and we discuss the Iran issue, and we have to give him credit for that. Regarding what happened on the Capitol Hill, I don't think we should blame anyone. We are not in a position to give grades to anyone, but we were sorry to see those things. I think, we all admire the US for the strength of democracy, for the freedom of speech. And I think many people looked up at the US and asked themselves, wow, if it's happening in DC, it can happen in every capital of the world. And I'm happy that the democracy prevailed and we saw a smooth transition of power.
Indeed. And just take you back to the United Nations, because it always fascinates me really when it's almost like a game in many ways, but obviously a very high stakes game. And Israel goes into the game as a player that has the board very much stacked against them. And in public, many of the ambassadors are far from supportive of Israel. But I'm interested to know if behind the scenes and in personal relationships, often maybe with countries that we wouldn't anticipate, you manage to develop those personal relationships, and that the personalities representing the countries are sometimes different to the country's official position.
So I found out, Paul, that you have a huge gap between the public UN and the private UN. So publicly, they will condemn Israel. Privately, they will admire Israel. And one of my goals was to narrow that gap. And in order to do that, I brought many ambassadors to Israel. And over the years, I led the delegations, and I brought more than 100 UN ambassadors to visit in Israel. And that is the best way to explain what's happening here. When they actually see the challenges, when they walk in the tunnels of Hamas and Hezbollah, and they see what we are dealing with, that was the best thing, and it helped. It showed us that when you educate, you can actually change results, and some of those countries changed their voting patterns at the UN, and we are grateful for that.
And would you say that the establishment of normalization with some of the countries in the Arab world that we've seen of late, was that in some part due to the relationships that you developed at the United Nations? It was a breakthrough that many people didn't see coming.
Absolutely. And, when we spoke about politics and diplomacy, one thing I learned that in politics, you have to claim credit immediately. In diplomacy, you do the opposite. You do everything quietly in order to deliver. And that's what I did. Many things that, one day when I will write a book, maybe I will be able to share with, but I'm very proud of the quiet thing that I achieved. And many of the normalization agreement started working together at the UN, working against Iran, collaborating with many countries. Some of them we already have diplomatic relations. Some of them it will take a few more months, I believe, until we will have diplomatic relations. But I traveled to the UAE, I think it was 4 or even 5 years ago, and we held discussions, and we had a lot of quiet meetings. It was very interesting because the coordination around those meetings were, today if I would meet a colleague from the UAE in New York, it's obvious. But in the past, we had to meet in a secret place. There were no TV, no media will see us meeting. Everything was much more complicated, and I'm very happy to see where we are today.
Yes, all that subterfuge can be placed on one side now that things are out in the open. And given what you've just said, are you quite confident then that the new Biden administration will also be supportive of moves to reach normalization with other nations in the not too distant future?
Regarding the normalization, I believe that the momentum will continue because it's important for the US. They gain respect. It's important for their allies. It brings stability to the region. I don't see why it will not continue. The only issue which I'm concerned about is the issue of the Iran deal, what they will do regarding the JCPOA, whether they will engage with the Iranians without us, without their allies in the region, whether they will demand changes in the agreement. And we all know today that the agreement was a bad agreement, and the reality of 2021 is not the reality of 2015. Today, Iran is more advanced in their nuclear ambitions, and unfortunately, we see what's happening today with the uranium enrichment, ballistic missile tests, their proxies. We have a problem. And I hope that the administration will not try to appease the Iranians, but actually to apply more pressure on them.
And as far as the new administration goes on that point, interviewing one or two people on our shows in recent weeks, one point was made that from one observer of Iran vis-a-vis America, that he says that the Biden administration won't be Obama-free. He thinks that Joe Biden will be more pragmatic and has a better understanding of the region than did Obama. And does that give you some cautious optimism that if they do go back into some sort of agreement, it will be more solid and less leaky than was the case in the previous agreement?
I definitely hope so. And I agree. I met President Biden in the past. I think, unlike President Obama, he will not try to come and dictate his vision. I think he will be more like President Clinton, who tried to negotiate, try to mediate between the sides. So I think it will be a different approach. But I think, there's a lot of pressure coming from different directions, from radical forces in the Democratic Party. And I hope that President Biden and his team will first come to their allies, or maybe they will call them. Maybe they should call Israel and their allies to come to the US to have a discussion before taking any decision regarding Iran.
Well, that was something that they did make public, didn't they, recently, that the Americans, the new administration said they will consult with all allies before any decisions were made. So it would be nice if those things are indeed come to pass. But I want to just take you back, actually, Ambassador Danon, because you've had a pretty stellar career as a young man in politics. And I just wondered, obviously, you're to the right of the political spectrum and you have views that tend to divide people as far as opinions are concerned. But I'm interested to know how your views were formed. Who was it that influenced you in your early days as a young man, even as a child or a youth, as to your political thinking? Was there anybody in particular?
So first, I beg to differ with you regarding right or left. I think today when you look at the political map in Israel, you see that the majority of the future parties, they share the same idea that I had 10 years ago. So maybe 10 years ago, it was considered to be to the right, but today you hear Prime Minister Netanyahu, and you hear most of the parties in the Knesset, and you understand that you don't have right and left, you have realism. And I was always, very realistic about what's happening on the ground in our region. Regarding the past, I think my late father, even though I didn't spend too much time with him, unfortunately, but the little time we did spend together influenced me as a youngster. It got me involved to learn our history, to learn our heritage, to read the Bible, and it actually brought me to public activities because of I understood that we have such a small and tiny country, and when you read our history, it's always about we have to fight. We shouldn't take it for granted. And when I came to the UN, I remember my first meeting with Ambassador Samantha Powell, and I told her I'm here to fight for my country. She told me, why to fight? Why you use the word fight? You can have a dialogue, you can promote. I told her that's my nature. I'm used to come to the arena and to fight for my country. And that's exactly what I did. I gained respect and I achieved a lot of things because every morning I woke up and I was willing to stand up and to fight for my country. And that I got from my father, who was a unique person. He made Aliyah from Egypt. He was wounded in the war of attrition. And despite his disabilities, he was able to educate me and to inspire me to be involved. Unfortunately, he passed away when I was young, but I am still very proud to continue. And I try to give to my children the desire to travel and to know the land.
It's very interesting. And as far outside of the family, sort of as political figures, who were the people that you looked up to when you were young? Who were the leaders that you thought, these people are thinking the way I think?
So Menachem Begin, definitely. Since 4th and 5th grade, I read all his books. And actually, I remember taking the bus to listen to his speeches. Back then, you used to have like rallies in public areas. I just took the bus and I went to listen to his speeches. Nobody encouraged me to do it. I just loved to hear him, and I appreciated him. But as I grew up and I got to know Prime Minister Shamir, who was not, a great speaker like Menachem Begin. He was not a great writer as Menachem Begin, but he was a great leader. And I had the chance to sit with him, to learn from him. And I think in his story, Menachem Begin got the respect he deserved. But regarding Prime Minister Shamir, I don't think many people actually know his legacy, his strengths, and I think he's one of the greatest prime ministers we ever had.
Well, and indeed, both the prime ministers that you've referred to, they were both people who were prepared to take hard decisions. And some people have said that of our current prime minister, the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history, Bibi Netanyahu, he isn't a prime minister that takes the big decision. He follows the way events are going. Do you feel that that's something that maybe he lacks, and that if you ever got to the position of having the highest office, you will be a Begin-like leader rather than a Netanyahu-like leader?
So Prime Minister Netanyahu did the great things for Israel and should be grateful for that. We mentioned the Abraham Accords and the COVID, and I worked with him very closely at the UN. And during my time at the UN, most of the period there was no Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I worked directly with the Prime Minister, and I learned to appreciate him, and he learned to appreciate me more than the time I was in his government. But I agree with you. Today, it's a different kind of leadership. Today, leaders read polls and they act according to the polls. And I think we should definitely go back to the days of Menachem Begin and Shamir, when leadership, the meaning was to actually show the way to the public and not to try to get the ideas of the public. Today, and that's not only in Israel. In most democracies, the leaders will go to the polls, get the ideas from the public, and will actually draft the messages accordingly. I think, in order to be a strong leader, sometimes you have to be able to tell the public exactly the opposite from what the public thinks. But today, it's becoming harder and harder.
And you mentioned that your relationship with the Prime Minister is a good one, particularly since your time as an ambassador, but it wasn't always such an easy, comfortable fit. And of course, it famously resulted in you being sacked when you were Deputy Defense Minister because of your criticism of the way he was handling the 2014 Gaza War. Two questions on that, because I think it says a great deal about your view on this particular issue, which is central, of course, to our way of life and our existence here in Israel. One, do you regret speaking publicly and criticizing the Prime Minister at that time? And two, do you wish you'd resigned before you were sacked? Because I understand that you had prepared a resignation letter, but he got him first.
So I think, if you are in public service, you have to be passionate about it. If you're not passionate about it, don't be in public service. Do something else. And I'm passionate about public service. And at that time, I want to remind you and the audience that we knew about the tunnels of Hamas. And I knew a lot of things as Deputy Minister of Defense. And I was very direct with the Prime Minister. I told him that, I think he should take action. Maybe, today when you look back, I should have used a different language, but I tried to do it quietly and then I did it publicly. And indeed, I don't think it's important if I would submit my resignation before he did. It was important for him. For me, it was important to put the public pressure. And when you look back, you understand that exactly what I said or demanded happened a few days after my resignation, and Israel did exactly what I demanded. And we dealt with the threat of the tunnels, and I think that was the right decision. But at that time, there was a lot of pressure coming from the US, mainly from Secretary Kerry, that pushed us not to take action against the tunnels. And my philosophy is that we should do whatever is good for Israel, and then we should consider our allies, including the US. I wrote a book about it, Israel, The Will to Prevail. You can still find it in Amazon, I think, Paul. And in that book, I wrote only about this issue, about when Israel has to take the tough decisions despite pressure coming from our allies. And today, when we speak about the Yom Kippur War and Golda Meir and what happened with Kissinger, and I gave many, many examples. And 2014 for me, I was actually there, and it all happened again. There was international pressure against taking any actions which were crucial for our security. So I think I did the right thing, but maybe, as you mentioned, I should have used a different language, but I'm not regret the positions I took.
And indeed, to be fair to you, at the time when, as I recall, I was reporting at the time for a major international news network from Israel, the polls were certainly suggesting that most of the public agreed with you, that the action against Hamas was not definitive, and we would just find ourselves going around in another circle. And recently I spoke to people that have been suffering from the fire bombings of the balloons and stuff on the Gaza border. How long do you think we should tolerate this type of action? Is it something that we can contain and put up with, or if you were in charge, would it be something that you would deal with an iron fist?
So, as a former Deputy Minister of Defense, there's an important point I want to make. We invest a lot in our defense. Some would say too much, but when you look at the budget, we spend billions of shekels instead of education, health infrastructure. We give it to the military to get ready. I expect when the time comes and we need to take action, I expect from the IDF to be decisive, to act strong, and to bring results. And I don't expect it to happen every day or every year, and hopefully it will be peaceful. But once we have to take action, I think all the budget we put into it, and the manpower, and the hours, as a cabinet member, we spend so much time and energy on security and not on other issues. So I expect that when we have to engage, we have to be decisive, and it should be very clear who is winning the war. We should not accept a reality that after 40 days, people would say both sides were successful. There are no both sides. If a terrorist organization is attacking Israel, we should defeat this terrorist organization, and it should be a lesson for the future. Because, today it has to do a lot with the image. When you read the Bible, I remember that, in few times it says that after each war, והארץ תשקוט 40 שנה, and the land will be quiet for 40 years. It means that, we send a clear message, and for 40 years, nobody actually thought about attacking you again. It's not happening today. Today, if you have 4 years, it's successful. So I do believe that if we have to engage, we have to hit our enemies very hard, so they will wait for a few years, not 40, but at least for a few years.
Well, we've sort of discussed that the Hamas side of the issue, but on the other side of the Palestinian issue is the Palestinian Authority, who are supposedly having elections. I think it's the first election in 14, 15 years of a much shorter term that Abu Mazen was elected to. I know that you believe in a one-state solution, which I'll come on to in a few moments, but as far as the elections go on the Palestinian side of things, is there anybody that you see in the Palestinian arena that could possibly be a partner in peace or in any meaningful negotiation with Israel?
So I am waiting for that day. And when President Abbas came to the Security Council, I asked him why he's supporting terrorism, why he's paying salaries to terrorists. And we wait for the day when a genuine leader like Anwar Sadat of Egypt came to Jerusalem. We wait for a Palestinian leader to come and say, enough with the bloodshed, let's talk peace. When that day will come, there will be a partner in our side. So I think we have to be patient about that. But at the same time, we should not make any mistakes like we did with Gaza, because today the situation in Gaza is not better for Israel, and it's not better for the Palestinians. They are suffering. They live under the occupation of Hamas. So I don't think we should rush and take decisions because of international pressure. We should wait for a real leader that we can engage and negotiate peace.
So do you feel that the recent announcement in recent days from the Biden administration that they support the return to the two-state idea, do you think that's a mistake on their part? When you first mooted the idea of a one-state solution, you were very much against the flow. Do you feel that that has changed, or do you accept that there is some form in which a two-state solution can work, and that maybe you would support if the details were right?
So I never spoke about a one-state solution, not about a two-state solution. I actually, in my book, spoke about a three-state solution, when we have the involvement of Jordan and Egypt in any regional. I believe in a regional agreement. I think the agreements today that we have with more moderate countries is important because it will allow the Palestinians to compromise, because everybody has to compromise in order to achieve any agreement. And I don't think they will be able to do it without the support of the moderate Arab countries. But I personally believe in a regional agreement with the involvement of Jordan and Egypt. But we have to have someone to negotiate with, and I don't see Abbas as a partner today. I think we will have to wait for another leader to emerge, and then hopefully, together with the moderate Arab countries and the Gulf countries, we can sit together and work out a regional agreement.
And in your conversations with these moderate Arab countries that have agreed the normalization process, are you encouraged that there is the genuine will from these people to express views very frankly to the Palestinians that they need to come to the table and they need to start to be serious about having a state and doing the right thing by Israel, as well as playing politics at home in the Palestinian Authority? Are the Arab states there that are going to back up the Israeli point of view?
So they are very pessimistic about the Palestinian leadership, more than we are. And I tell them that we have to deal with this issue because they are not going anywhere, and we are not going anywhere. But, when I have a discussion and I have my notes ready, usually it will be me bringing up the Palestinian issue, because many of them, they had bad experience, they are disappointed, and they want to move on to other issues where they think things can happen and not go back to the Palestinian issue where nothing happened.
Okay, well, we shall see over the next few months and going forward what's going to happen. First of all, if the elections take place in the Palestinian Authority and what the outcome is going to be. Just very quickly, Mohammed Dakhlan, do you think he's a realistic candidate and somebody that maybe Israel could work with if he were to win an election there?
I don't think we should be the one deciding about the future of the Palestinian leadership. And I don't think it would be wise for us to give grades. I think any leader that will abandon the violence, will abandon the culture of hate that we see today, will be a partner for us. But today, unfortunately, we see that most of them, they choose to continue with that direction instead of educating the next generation about a possibility of peace. And that's a problem because, I remember as a child, I used to meet Palestinian children. We used to travel, they used to come to work in Israel. Today, a Palestinian child or Israeli child will never meet one each other. And today, when you look at the curriculum in the PA, what they're teaching there, it will be very hard to actually get the support of the public for any future agreement.
And just as regards the indoctrination of the Palestinians, maybe not quite to the same extent, but do you feel that the action of some of the more extremist settlers in the West Bank, do you think that does damage to Israel's claims that we hold the moral high ground? Do you think it's time to rein them in and show that we're not happy to have extremism of any kind in that particular area?
I think, Paul, we should condemn violence, period, but you cannot put it together. The equation is not right, and I explain why. In Israel, if something will happen, we will all condemn it. In the Palestinian Authority, on the contrary, they will glorify it. They will actually name a square or a school after convicted terrorists. So we are not doing that. We are ashamed when it happens, and we expect the law and order and the police to enforce it everywhere. But in the PA, they glorify it. And the best example is always, and I try to change it, is the issue of the pay to slay. When they actually spend, today I had a debate with many people from the left about the vaccines. And they claim that we are not giving vaccines to the Palestinians. And I asked them why they don't buy it. We can help them to purchase vaccines. But instead of spending money on the health of the Palestinians, they spend millions of dollars every month giving salaries to convicted murderers. So I think we cannot make that comparison because we do not glorify terrorism.
Okay, we'll move on. It's certainly an interesting point about the Seder Adifut, as we would say in Hebrew, the priorities that the Palestinians have as far as their financial resources are concerned. I think a lot of people would agree with you on that one. I just want to talking about elections. Obviously, there's another election coming up in Israel very soon. Did you feel a little bit sort of out on the wing when you were out in New York and all the different elections were going on every few months in Israel? It must have been a strange feeling watching on from the States and seeing what was going on in Israel through the first three elections.
Well, yeah, I followed it very carefully, and every time I got a phone call, whether I'm coming back or not for the elections, and it was very hard for me to explain to my colleagues what's happening in our democracy. And I hope that now, when we have the fourth election in 2 years, we're going to have a government that will be able to govern. Because, when you look at Israel today from the outside, there is nothing to be proud about our democracy because we are not capable of putting together a government for the last 2 years.
Just on that point, do you feel that the model of democracy that we have needs some adjustment because of the threshold that parties are able to achieve a place in the Knesset? It means that very often we get so many of these small parties involved in forming governments, and you end up to some degree with the tail wagging the dog. In other countries that have the proportional representation, they have a much higher threshold, which can often lead to much more stable government. Would you be in favor of a change to the raising of the threshold?
Indeed, I support raising the threshold for many years when I was in the Knesset. But I think it's a challenge not only for us. You look at all democracies today in the US, in Europe. You understand that there is a challenge. It's a choppy, messy, ugly system. But like Churchill once said, you cannot find a better one. So I think we should be grateful for what we have, but indeed look for ways to make the amendments and to bring more stability to the system.
And what do you think, looking, we're about 8 weeks away from the election. First of all, as I understand it, the Likud, they aren't having primaries. So how are we going to know who's going to be on the list and where will you feature on that list?
So the Likud decided to submit the same list from last time and to do copy-paste, if you want to call it. And that's a decision of the party. I intend to come back to public service. It will not happen immediately, but we're going to have another elections, and definitely I see myself as one of the leading candidates in the party, not only to be a member of Knesset, but also when the time will come and Netanyahu will not be the candidate of the Likud party, I see myself as one of the potential candidates to lead the party. So I will intend to support the party, to be active, and I hope that the party will get enough seats to form a government.
So are you frustrated that because of this copy-paste idea that you're not going to be able to be part of the forthcoming Knesset? Is that something that grates at you a little bit?
I'm not happy about it, but I understand it with COVID and all the restrictions, to hold the primaries, it's challenging. I always fought for democracy in the party, and I think in the future, we have to fight to bring more democracy to the party. I think it's crucial that we will keep the institutions and we will keep the bylaws. And I used to fight a lot about those issues. and I intend to come back to the arena and to make sure that we keep the Likud the largest and the most democratic party in Israel.
And I know we're running out of time, so just a couple more quick questions. Obviously, a very senior figure in the Likud party for many years, Gideon Sa'ar, has left and formed his own party. Just a reaction to that. And is it ever something that's crossed your mind that your political career may well advance quicker if you were to strike off in a slightly different direction under your own flag?
I think for the short term, maybe. For the long term, definitely not. When you look at the history of the parties, all those parties, yes, for the short term, they got, better positions, like Moshe Kahlon and others. But then in the long run, it's very hard to become the prime minister of Israel if you are not part of one of the major parties. And also, I grew up in the Likud. It's part of myself. And I think, we should be patient. And even if when you want to change things, and by the way, I have a lot of criticism about what happened in the party and in the government, but I believe we change from the inside and not from the outside.
Okay, well, that's a pretty strong message. And just as far as Gideon Sa'ar is concerned, do you feel he has made a mistake personally, politically? And do you feel that he will achieve anything at these elections? And if he does, do you think he will be able to work with Benjamin Netanyahu if indeed the Likud is the biggest single party?
I think we will have to wait and see. I think there were a lot of mistakes done from all sides. I think it was a mistake not to nominate him as a minister in the government. I was number 5 on the list. I think he was number 4 last time when he ran. So I think we should respect democracy. And I think it was a mistake not to nominate him. But still, I don't think it was justified to form a new party. One thing, I'm happy about when I see the polls, that you see that the right-wing parties are the majority. So for the first time, you're going to have, I think, between 70 to 80 MKs from the right. Some of them will not sit with Netanyahu, but when you actually analyze their positions regarding Judea and Samaria, regarding security, regarding other issues, you see that I think it will be the largest majority of conservative member of Knesset in the history of Israel.
And just going back to the Prime Minister for one moment, obviously he faces these court cases, the 3 cases. How comfortable or uncomfortable are you that the leader of your party, the Prime Minister, is facing such a situation? And do you think, as it would be in many other countries, that it would have been the right thing to step down and defend himself, and then, if he is cleared, to be able to step back? Do you think it makes life more difficult for him to concentrate on what is already a very difficult job as a Prime Minister?
So I think we should look at it from a different perspective, and not what's happening with Netanyahu today, because we all have emotions and we have our political ideas from left to right. I think in the future we should have a system that will allow the Prime Minister to continue to govern. So either you tell the system, okay, if you want to indict him, you will do it after he finishes his term. I'm not talking about Netanyahu today. I'm talking about the future, what we should do. Or you should decide that if he's indicted, he cannot continue as a Prime Minister. So you make it clear. I do think that's something we should address, but not today. Today, it's very emotional, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, he believes that he's innocent. He told me that, and I think he deserves the right to prove it in court, and that's what he's doing today.
Well, of course, those cases are coming up later this year, and the public and the world will be watching very closely to see what happens there. But it's been absolutely fascinating chatting with you, Danny Danon. I just want to ask you one final question. Tell me something that the public don't know about you, about your personal interests away from politics. What is it that makes Danny Danon tick when he takes the tie off after the end of this interview? And what is it that really gives you a buzz outside of the political arena? So
I love to learn new things, and always I'm trying to learn new things, the languages. And so now I'm actually learning to swim, even though I know how to swim, but professionally.
Swim better, yes.
And I enjoy it a lot. And also I'm starting to go back to my Arabic. I speak some Arabic, but after visiting some of the countries in the region and making new friends, I found out that, I know the language, but I have to improve it. So those two things, I think, are new to you and to the audience.
Well, those are two. Maybe you'll have a go at the Tzlichat HaKineret, the swimming across the Kinneret.
I did it with my son. But
you've done that?
Yeah, definitely I intend to do it again with my daughters.
And do it maybe even quicker now that you've learned to swim even better. Well, I hope that you continue to swim in your own direction politically, and that you succeed in what you want to do in politics. And I'm very grateful to you for joining us here on Real Israel. Ambassador Danny Danon, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul.
And thank you very much to you for joining us. We'll be back with another special interview in due course. But from me, Paul Alster, it's bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.